The entire trip to Texas was at the request of Jack Valenti. Jack Valenti, I believe, was put through some sort of weird initiation through his participation in the assassination, because not only did he send the letter inviting Kennedy to Texas, he hosted all the events. He organized, him and his company organized all of the events that Kennedy spoke at. He also sat on the board of the Dallas Citizens Council with Sam Bloom, who oversaw the routing of the motorcade. It was Jack Valenti's company, Weekly and Valenti, that released the details of the motorcade on the 18th of November. Right. So this is a really big deal because they say that Lee Harvey Oswald saw in the newspaper the route of the motorcade as on the 18th. And that's how he planned to kill the president on the 22nd. That was all done by Jack Valenti. The route of the motorcade was in part planned by Jack Valenti. And then Jack Valenti is the shooter on the grassy knoll, the quintessential grassy knoll shooter. David Ferrie fired the first shot, and that struck Kennedy in the throat. When he grabs his neck like this, he was not shot from behind. He was shot from David Ferrie from the front. And the series of events that led me to identify David Ferrie took me a long time. But ultimately, we have a description of the same man given from behind the grassy knoll by a guy named Ed Hoffman. Ed Hoffman sees a guy shoot the rifle, turn around, throw it to another man, whom I identified as Andrew Jerome Blackman. And so David Ferrie throws the rifle to Blackman. Blackman breaks it down, puts it into a toolbox. Ed Hoffman says that this man, who he describes as wearing a black hat and a blue jacket, which later when he films with Oliver Stone during JFK, he clarifies that the guy was wearing a black felt hat with a wide band and a dark blue suit jacket, okay? This person is then photographed on the pergola after the assassination. They're then photographed walking in the railroad yards. We then have a witness named Velma, who called into Coast to Coast AM, November 22nd, 2006, and gives her testimony. First time anyone's ever heard from this woman named Velma. And she basically describes this man with the black felt hat, dark suit, and he has real heavy eyebrows, and he's sitting in a gray Plymouth. And basically there's an interaction between this person and J.D. Tippit, which, again, most people, think is BS, but I completely believe it. J.D. Tippit is the police officer who will be shot shortly after Kennedy is assassinated in Oak Cliff. So I'll continue with David Ferrie because it connects directly to the Tippit shooting. So David Ferrie, the reason that David Ferrie had real heavy eyebrows was because he had to paint them on, because he had no hair. And most people think that he had alopecia. He didn't have alopecia. There are numerous references to David Ferrie having been a U-2 pilot in the Kennedy literature. And when you study the early U-2 pilots, the pressurization of the suits at 70,000 feet caused many of the initial test pilots to lose all their hair and never grow any of it back. I believe that is what happened to David Ferrie. I do not believe he had alopecia. There's no evidence he had alopecia at all. But that's the reason that he painted on his eyebrows, and that's why he's always described as having real heavy eyebrows everywhere he goes. From there, I trace that gray Plymouth to the Tippit shooting, where J.D. Tippit is ultimately shot by two people. He's shot 3 times by Kerry Thornley. He shot 1 time by David Ferrie. I trace David Ferrie to the scene by tracing the vehicle, which is described by 3 people at the Tippit shooting as having been present. They also describe a man on scene who was reloading a revolver at the time, who had a dark felt hat and a dark blue jacket on. Hello. Same description as the grassy knoll between the 2 witnesses there. I then am able to trace the vehicle that David Ferrie will eventually leave Dallas in, a light blue Ford Falcon station wagon. I'll eventually locate the address that was stored at, and I will trace David Ferrie leaving Dallas that night, heading to Hammond, Louisiana, where he hides out the entire weekend with a guy named Thomas Compton. And I have all the documents to back all of this up. Many people know the story of David Ferrie going to the Winterland Ice Arena, which is an ice rink that David Ferrie allegedly went ice skating on. And this was his alibi. He couldn't have killed the president, couldn't have been involved because he was ice skating with 2 kids in Houston. Well, he didn't go to Houston. The guy who went to Houston was a guy named Sergio Arcacha Smith. And he was basically posing as David Ferrie there. And then, when you look at the testimony in the Warren Commission of the guy who was present at the ice skating rink, it becomes apparent that the ice skating rink is a CIA front. And ultimately, what I found out was that the owner of the Winterland Ice Rink, which was meant to provide an alibi for David Ferrie, was owned by Lyndon Johnson. The Johnson family enterprise owned tons of real estate throughout Houston, and I I just so happened to get into a Facebook group formed in 2018 by people who actually used to go ice skating at the Winterland. And they shared all their old memories, all the stories, all the pictures. And Richard Rowland, who allegedly was the son of Roulon Rowland, who testified at the Warren Commission that he saw David Ferry, he basically acknowledged that Lyndon Johnson was the owner. And it's the first time anyone has ever made that determination. And so people who think that like that David Ferry went there and it was just like some, he just went ice skating and it wasn't some sort of alibi, like they're crazy. And when you really kind of wonder like what was going on with the Winterland, it was a CIA front. The woman running it was named Mary Boots Roberts, who actually in her obituary says she goes on to work for the NASA for the Gemini and Apollo missions. But anybody who knows anything about NASA knows they were an intelligence front and they were basically putting people on payroll and funneling money to the CIA. There's a big story, Mary Boots Roberts, who's definitely a CIA agent. But ultimately, she has a first cousin whose name is, Vincent Calderon Jr., who I identify as the short tramp in Dealey Plaza. He's also the real Raoul who set up James Earl Ray, in the Martin Luther King assassination. And Vincent Calderon Jr. is also the former brother-in-law of Jack Valente. You constantly have these weird cycles and circles and connections. And anybody who studies intelligence needs to study genealogies and families because the CIA likes to recruit families. And you'll be amazed at who's related to who when you start to dig into this stuff. So.